Tonight, we're joining a small dungeoneering party who've pretty much had enough of the rough life. Questing just doesn't pay like it used to. Not when there's a new hero popping up every other day to slay some dragon, or a necromancer around every corner animating the undead yet again. And with Halloween coming up, it seems like the perfect time for a new opportunity to present itself to our adventurers. A noble Justicar, a tieflin rogue, and a gnome wizard who may or may not have a shady past. I really love writing these Dungeons and Dragons style stories and couldn't pass up the chance for a Halloween edition. So if you like what I do here and want a way to support the channel, then consider checking out my Patreon, linked down below. But for now, grab a tankard of hot chocolate. Kick your feet up at the local tavern, or Thieves Guild, or Wizard's Tower, whatever it is you're into, and let's begin. Justicar Nicholas Highforge set his warhammer down with a dull clang that echoed through the dank corridors of the dungeon and immediately slumped against the rough stone wall. He rubbed at his wrists, wincing at the fresh bruises that had already started to bloom purple beneath his gauntlets. "I should have just become a bard," he muttered, tilting his head back until it thumped against the stone. "Like my sister. By the light, it would have been so much easier, singing songs and flirting with wenches in every tavern in town, instead of getting battered and bruised by overgrown rats and delusional goblins." Nicholas cut an impressive figure when he wasn't slumped against dungeon walls. Though he was much slimmer than others of his order, he made up for it in height. He had dark hair cropped short in the practical style of the Justicars, and his face bore honest features that made villagers trust him instantly. But right now those features were twisted in a grimace of exhaustion. "Delusional is putting it mildly," Jerica said from where she crouched nearby, wiping green goblin blood from her twin daggers with a scrap of cloth she pulled out from one of her many pockets. Jerica was a striking figure, even covered in goblin gore. Crimson skin marked with darker patterns that swirled up along her arms, giving the illusion of living tattoos, with curved horns that swept back from her temples. A collection of lockpicks dangled from a thin chain around her neck like macabre jewelry, and her belt was festooned with an impressive array of pouches, each one holding God knew what. The tiefling's tail flicked with irritation, the spaded tip narrowly missing a puddle of something the Justicar didn't care to identify. I mean, they were worshipping a pumpkin. "A very large pumpkin," Bink Burnside corrected. The gnome's nasally voice carried more cheer than either of his companions could muster. He'd perched himself atop an overturned crate, one of many the goblins had pilfered from merchant caravans over the past month, and was rifling through his component pouch with single-minded focus. And to be fair to the little buggers, it was quite an impressive specimen of Cucurbita maxima. I can see why they— "Bink," Jerica interrupted, not looking up from her work. "Nobody cares about the botanical classification." "I care," Pink sniffed, then brightened. Here we are." He whispered an incantation, and with a strange little gesture, 2 butter cookies materialized in the air before him. They were still warm and smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. They dropped into his waiting hands, and he broke them off into a few pieces, then offered them to each of his companions. Jerica caught her cookie pieces with her tail. It was a party trick she'd perfected over years of annoying Nicholas, and popped one into her mouth while examining the other critically. "You know, For someone who can literally create food from nothing, you'd think you'd be less stingy with portions. The laws of arcane thermodynamics are not stingy, Bink explained, pushing his spectacles up his nose with a stained finger. They're immutable. If I could conjure a feast from a cantrip, don't you think I would? Do you have any idea how many nights I've stayed up trying to optimize the manner-to-calorie conversion rate? He gestured emphatically with his cookie, sending crumbs flying. The breakthrough I've made with these butter cookies alone could revolutionize. The gnome trailed off when he realized his companions weren't paying the slightest bit of attention. With a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his considerable height, Nicholas pushed himself off the wall and accepted the offered cookie. It was, he had to admit, quite good. Bink's conjured pastries always were, even if they did have a weird arcane aftertaste sometimes. Still, it did little to improve his mood as he surveyed the carnage around them. The dungeon was an absolute mess. Broken goblin weaponry littered the ground like autumn leaves. Crude totems constructed from stolen farm equipment leaned drunkenly against the walls. Somewhere deeper in, a cooking fire still smoldered, filling the air with the acrid smell of burnt something. Nicholas didn't want to know what the goblins had been cooking. And there, in what the goblins had clearly designated as their shrine room, sat the object of their quest. Old Mossback's prize pumpkin, easily the size of a beer barrel, squatting on a makeshift altar of crates and moth-eaten blankets. The goblins had decorated it with a crown fashioned from bent spoons, and had surrounded it with offerings of shiny rocks and a collection of missing left boots. "Okay," Nicholas said, brushing cookie crumbs from his tabard. The gold sunburst emblazoned across his chest was so caked with dungeon grime it looked more like a brown blob. "Let's get His Majesty the Pumpkin back to the village before the goblins' cousins show up looking for revenge." "Do goblins have cousins?" Bink asked, hopping down from his crate with surprising grace for someone barely 3 feet tall. "Everything has cousins," Jerica replied, sheathing her daggers in a fluid motion. "Trust me on this." It took them the better part of an hour to maneuver the massive pumpkin onto the wheelbarrow they'd found abandoned near the dungeon entrance, presumably stolen from the same farm the pumpkin had come from. Another hour saw them trudging through the woods of Arakai, taking turns pushing the squeaking, wobbling wheelbarrow along the forest path while the other two walked alongside, ready to catch the pumpkin should it decide to make a break for freedom. The woods were lovely this time of year, Nicholas supposed, if one had the energy to appreciate such things. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red and gold, and they crunched satisfyingly underfoot. The air had that strange, crispy quality that made him think of warm hearts and mulled cider. Through the canopy, he could see the afternoon sun slanting through the branches in those long golden rays that painters were always trying to capture. He was too tired to care about any of it. By the time they emerged from the forest and trudged up the road to the village of Millhaven, a collection of about 40 buildings clustered around a central square, surrounded by farmland that stretched toward the horizon, Nicholas's arms felt like overcooked noodles, and his back was screaming in protest. A small crowd had gathered in the village square, and a cheer went up when they spotted the adventurers and their prize cargo. Old Mossback himself, a weathered farmer, with more beard than face, rushed forward with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Me pumpkin," he cried, clutching at the massive gourd as though it were a long-lost child. "My beautiful girl. Oh, bless you, adventurers, bless you." The village bailiff was a portly man named Hendrik Bramble, who always looked like he'd just eaten something sour. He stepped forward with considerably less enthusiasm. He held a small leather purse, which he hefted once before opening the drawstring and peering inside with the expression of a man being asked to part with his own kidney. "Yes, well," Hendrik cleared his throat. "The village thanks you for your service. As promised, here is your reward." He appended the purse into Nicholas's waiting palm. 5 gold coins, 8 silver, and a handful of copper clinked into his gauntleted hand. Nicholas let the coins slide from his palm back into his other hand, counting again, as if the amount might somehow increase through sheer force of will. For a long moment, the 3 adventurers simply stared at the pitiful pile of coins. "That's—" Bink started, then stopped. His pointed ears had gone slightly pink. "That's it?" "That's the agreed-upon reward," Hendrik said, snapping the empty purse shut with an air of finality. "You cleared out the goblins, returned the pumpkin. Job's done." Jerica's tail had gone very still, which Nicholas had learned was never a good sign. "We nearly died," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Twice." "Well, yes, that is rather the nature of adventuring work, isn't it?" Hendrik replied, already turning away. "Do try not to spend it all in one place, yes." Nicholas divided the coins as fairly as he could, 1 gold and some silver each, with the copper distributed evenly. And the 3 of them stood in the village square, staring at their shares with matching expressions of disbelief. The other 2 gold coins had gone into a shared pool they used to repair armor and buy adventuring equipment and health potions. "This is barely enough for a week's rations," Nicholas said slowly. "Only if we're very frugal, and if the merchants take pity on us," Jerica corrected, making one of her gold coins disappear with a practiced flourish, then reappear behind Bink's ear. The gnome didn't even flinch. He'd long since grown accustomed to her nervous habits, had eaten nothing but stale bread and questionable cheese. Bink pocketed his share with a sigh. "I vote we retire to the Cracked Flagon for the night. At least we can afford a decent room and a hot meal before we have to decide whether to take up begging or highway robbery." "The Flagon it is, then," Nicholas agreed, and together they trudged toward the village's only inn, their shoulders slumped with exhaustion and disappointment. The Cracked Flagon was doing brisk business that evening, packed with villagers enjoying their supper-time ale and gossip. A fire roared in the decently sized hearth that dominated one wall, and above it hung the inn's namesake, a wooden flagon split down the middle, supposedly cleaved by a barbarian's axe during a brawl 20 years prior. The proprietor was a woman named Gerta Stonemill, and by the looks of her, she could have given any of Nicholas's paladin brothers a run for their money in an arm wrestling contest. She greeted them with a gap-toothed smile and directed them to a corner table near the kitchen. Nicholas ordered stew, because when you were this tired and this disappointed, only something hot and filling would do. While Jerica asked for the fish pie and Bink requested a vegetable medley. Gerta noted down the orders before disappearing into the kitchen to shout at her cook. When the food arrived, Nicholas found himself staring morosely into his bowl, barely mustering the energy to lift his spoon. He'd been watching the other patrons while they waited, going about their normal, jolly evening. It was peaceful, ordinary, everything he'd thought he wanted to protect when he'd joined the Justicars. Saving the innocent and seeing justice meted out is all well and good, he muttered, more to his stew than to his companions. But it doesn't put meat and mutton on the table, does it? That's why I supplement my earnings, Jerica said cheerfully, producing a small coin purse that Nicholas was fairly certain hadn't been on her person a moment ago. At his sharp look, she grinned, her pointed teeth glinting in the firelight. Oh, don't give me that face. I only swipe from people who can afford it. See that merchant by the door? His belt purse was so heavy it was throwing off his gait. I did him a favor, really. His back will thank me. Nicholas opened his mouth to deliver his standard lecture about theft and morality and the tenets of the Paladin Order, then closed it again. The words felt hollow when his own purse was so light. Instead, he dipped his spoon into the bowl, with perhaps more force than necessary, and got a bit of stew on his tabard. Bink was paying attention to neither of them. He sat hunched over his plate, taking small, methodical bites of his vegetables, while a tiny blue flame danced around his index finger. It was a simple cantrip to keep his food warm as he ate. His eyes had gone distant, which Nicholas had learned meant the gnome's considerable mind was working through some problem or another. Bink, Nicholas tried, waving a hand in front of the wizard's face. You still with us? What? Oh, yes. Yes, I'm here. Bink blinked, the blue flame flickering out. Just thinking about how we're going to afford next month's rent on the Guildhall room? Jerica asked, stealing a piece of bread from Nicholas's basket before he could stop her. About opportunity, Bink said slowly, his eyes focusing on something across the room. Nicholas followed his gaze to where Goethe stood behind the bar, chatting with a handful of regulars. Old Mossback was there, of course, regaling anyone who would listen with the tale of his pumpkin's harrowing rescue. Two farmers Nicholas didn't know by name were leaning against the bar, nursing their ales. It's going to be the centerpiece of the All Hallows' Eve celebration, Mossback was saying. His voice carried across the common room, and it sounded like he'd had a few drinks already. We'll carve her up right in the town square 2 weeks from tonight. It'll be magnificent. All Hallows' Eve in the town square, one of the farmers said, sounding less than thrilled. Riveting stuff, that. Watching a pumpkin get carved. There'll be apple bobbing, Gertie added, though she didn't sound particularly convinced either. Apple bobbing, Jerica repeated, wrinkling her nose in disgust. That sounds like an awfully boring way to celebrate the scariest and best night of the year. Nicholas was too busy spinning his single gold coin on the table, watching it catch the firelight as it whirled. The motion was hypnotic, and he found himself speaking without really thinking about it. I wish the village folk knew how tough it is to be an adventurer, how much we risk for them day in and day out. The coin wobbled, threatened to fall, then righted itself for another rotation. If they knew what we went through in that dungeon, the giant rats, the goblin chieftain with his poisoned blade, that trapped corridor that nearly crushed us all into paste, surely they wouldn't be so stingy with the rewards. The coin finally toppled over with a soft clink. That's it, Bink exclaimed, slamming his small fist on the table with such force that his vegetables jumped on his plate. The blue flame that had been dancing around his finger suddenly sparked to life again, shooting up a good foot in the air with a sharp crack of displaced energy. Several patrons at nearby tables jumped in surprise, and one man, a blacksmith named Torment, who was always complaining about something, sloshed his ale down the front of his shirt. "Oh, you rascal," Torment bellowed, glaring at their table. "Watch it, you menace." "Sorry, terribly sorry," Bink called back, not sounding sorry at all. His eyes were alight with an excitement that Nicholas hadn't seen since the time they'd stumbled upon that abandoned arcane library in the Whistling Caves. "But I've just had the most brilliant idea." Jerica leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. Her tail curled around one of the chair legs, another nervous habit. "This should be good. The last time you had a brilliant idea, we ended up fighting a gelatinous cube in a storm drain." "That was one time," Bink protested. "And we learned valuable information about the digestive properties of oozes. We learned that they dissolve leather," Jerica counted. "I lost my favorite boots." "If I may," Bink interrupted, fixing them both with an intense stare. "What if we gave the village folk a chance to experience what we go through? What if we let them live like adventurers for an evening?" Nicholas exchanged a glance with Jerica, who looked equally baffled. "Bink, I don't think we can train an entire village worth of people to fight goblins in 2 weeks." No. Bink waved the concern away impatiently. "We don't train him. We give them something to really celebrate on All Hallows Eve. Something scary, something thrilling, something that will make their apple bobbing look like a child's game in comparison." He leaned forward, getting really excited now. "We turn the dungeon into a haunted house attraction, and we charge admission." The table fell silent. Jerica was the first to speak. "All that arcane dabbling's really gotten to you, hasn't it, Bink?" "Think about it." Bink was practically vibrating with enthusiasm now. He was bouncing in a way that made him look like an enthusiastic child, rather than a wizard approaching his 5th decade. "The dungeon is already cleared out. The atmosphere is perfect, dark, damp, full of corridors and spooky chambers. We fix the place up a bit, use our skills to make it properly frightening, and charge a couple of gold coins per person for entry. 2 weeks is plenty of time to prepare." "A couple of gold coins," Nicholas repeated, trying to work through the mathematics, which he wasn't much good at. "Per person." "Yes," Bink confirmed. "Imagine if even half the village decides to come. That's 20 households. Let's say 4 people each. That's 80 people, times 2 gold each. That's 160 gold." Jerica finished, sitting up straighter. Her tail had begun to swish back and forth, a sure sign of interest. "In a single night. More than we've made in the last 6 months of questing," Nicholas breathed. "Precisely." Bink clapped his hands together. "We create an experience. A night of scares, a chance for ordinary folk to feel like adventurers exploring a dangerous dungeon, but without any actual danger. Well," he amended, "without any permanent danger. A few scares never hurt anyone. Metaphorically speaking." Nicholas found himself nodding eagerly, despite his better judgment. "But how would we make it scary enough? The dungeon is just empty caves now. We cleared out all the goblins." Bink's grin was positively wicked. "Leave that to me. Or rather, to us." He gestured to encompass all 3 of them. "We each have skills and abilities that would be perfect for this. Jerica, you're a rogue. You know traps better than anyone. I could set up some mostly harmless surprises." Jerica mused, her fingers already twitching as though itching to get to work. Tripwires, falling nets, false floors that drop people a few feet onto cushions. Nothing that would actually hurt anyone, but enough to make them jump. Exactly. And I, Bink continued, can enchant the place within an inch of its life. Those old suits of armor the goblins had lying around. I can make them move, make them look like they're coming alive. The weapons, I'll make them float and rattle. I can change the color of the flames in the torches, make them burn green or purple. Illusions, sounds, magical effects. The possibilities are endless. It took Nicholas a moment to realize the other two were waiting for him to contribute. Oh, right. He scratched at his stubbled jaw, thinking. Well, I suppose I could use my holy magic to create glowing sigils on the walls. Make it look like some forbidden temple. And I could put on my full ceremonial armor, the old stuff I never wear, and stand very still in dark corners. People always tell me I'm intimidating when I stand still. Because you're built like a lamppost, Jerica said, not unkindly. You could definitely pull off the creepy guardian statue routine. Perfect. Bink was bouncing in his seat. We'll need to advertise, of course. Let the whole region know. Posters in the village, word of mouth. Maybe send some notices to the neighboring towns. I know a guy, Jerica said. He runs a print shop in Millhaven. And he owes me a favor. You mean you have dirt on him? Nicholas asked, already knowing the answer. I prefer leverage, Jerica replied smoothly. But yes, I can get us posters by tomorrow morning. Nicholas looked between his two companions. The diminutive gnome wizard, who was already sketching diagrams on a napkin with a bit of charcoal, and the tieflin rogue, who was no doubt planning something delightfully devious. Despite his exhaustion, despite his aching muscles and his defeated spirit, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long while. Hope, and perhaps a touch of excitement. So it's decided, he said, picking up his gold coin and flipping it in the air before catching it with a decisive snap. Let's build ourselves a haunted house. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with a hint of frost on the ground that melted away as the sun climbed higher. Nicholas found himself standing outside Millhaven's modest print shop, which was nothing more than a narrow building wedged between the apothecary and a cobbler. Watching through the window as Jerica leaned across the counter, speaking in low tones with the proprietor, a nervous man named Aldous Finch. Whatever she said made Aldous go pale, nod frantically, and immediately begin setting type into his printing press with trembling hands. I don't want to know, Nicholas muttered, when Jerica emerged 20 minutes later with a satisfied smirk and a promise that 200 posters would be ready by midday. Then don't ask, she replied cheerfully. True to Aldous' word, or perhaps to his fear, the posters were ready by noon, still smelling of fresh ink. Bink had outdone himself with the design. Bold letters announced The Haunted House of Arakai, with a subtitle promising A Night of Scares and Adventure, if you dare. Below that, in smaller print, All Hallows Eve, dusk until midnight. 2 gold coins per person. The Woods of Arakai. Follow the torches. Not recommended for the faint of heart. Not recommended for the faint of heart, Nicholas read aloud. That's a bit dramatic, isn't it? It's perfect, Bink insisted. It's mysterious, enticing. People will be curious. He waved his small hands in the air as he spoke. They spent the afternoon plastering posters across Millhaven and the surrounding area. Nicholas took the cracked flagon and the village notice board in the square. Jerica disappeared into the various guild halls, the Merchants' Guild, the Farmers' Collective, even the small Temple of the Dawn, where Nicholas's fellow paladins met for weekly services. Bink, being the most personable despite his size, visited the apothecary, the general store, and even convinced Gerta to hang one prominently behind the bar. By late afternoon, it seemed every surface in Millhaven that could hold a poster had one. They'd even sent a stack with a traveling merchant heading toward the next town over, with instructions to spread the word. They had to pay him using the leftover gold from the previous day, but Bink assured them it was a sound investment. "Not bad," Nicholas said, surveying their handiwork as the three of them stood in the town square. The poster on the notice board fluttered slightly in the breeze, drawing curious looks from passing villagers. "Now comes the hard part." Bink shook his head and adjusted his pointed hat with an air of determination. "No. Now comes the fun part." The woods of Arakai seemed somehow different, now that they were approaching the dungeon, not as adventurers seeking glory and gold, but as... what? Theatrical producers? Set designers? Nicholas wasn't entirely sure what to call what they were doing, but he had to admit there was something appealing about the change in perspective. The dungeon entrance yawned before them, a dark mouth carved into the hillside and half hidden by overgrown ivy and moss. The afternoon sun barely penetrated the forest canopy here, leaving the area in a perpetual twilight that was perfectly atmospheric for what the group had planned. Bink pulled out a piece of parchment covered in sketches and notes. "I've drawn up a basic floor plan based on my memory of the layout. We'll want to create a clear path for visitors to follow. Can't have them wandering off and getting lost. Technically, we don't know how deep these caves go. There could be a whole other level above or beneath or both, and then we'd be liable, and the bailiff might arrest us." "By the light, Bink. Just get to the point," huffed the Justicar. Jerica was already circling the entrance, her keen eyes picking out details. "The natural bottleneck here at the entrance is good. We can control the flow of people, make sure not too many go in at once. Don't want it getting crowded and ruining the scares." "How many people should we let in at a time?" Nicholas asked, setting down the large pack he'd brought from the inn. It was filled with supplies they'd purchased that morning. Rope, cloth, nails, tar, and a dozen other odds and ends that Bink had insisted they'd need. "Groups of 4 to 6, Bink said immediately. Then he started laying out the logic and sensibility behind needing the groups to be small enough to feel isolated and vulnerable, and how to space out the groups going in and out. Jerica asked him at some point how he knew so much about this kind of operation, but Bink doesn't like to talk about his past, which his companions assured themselves was fine. Surely he wasn't a warlock with a shady past or anything. They spent the first hour simply cleaning. The goblin bodies had been dragged out the day before and disposed of by the village guard. Nicholas tried not to think too hard about where, but plenty of goblin detritus remained. Broken pottery, scraps of moldy food, suspicious stains that needed several castings of Bink's prestidigitation cantrip to remove. Nicholas wiped his brow with the back of his hand once the main corridor was relatively clean. "This is officially the least heroic thing I've ever done." "I don't know," Jerica said, dragging a sack of garbage toward the entrance. "I once spent 3 days in a sewer, tracking a murloc. This is pleasant in comparison." You've lived a very strange life, you know, Nicholas mused. Says the man who talks to his god before breakfast. The rogue teased him back. As they worked deeper into the dungeon, the real transformation began. Bink started with the lighting. He moved from torch bracket to torch bracket, murmuring incantations and weaving complex patterns with his fingers. Where before the torches had burned with ordinary orange flames, now they flickered with eerie lights that made the whole space look more like a vampire's hideout than some nasty old cave. "How long will that last?" Nicholas asked, watching in fascination as another torch shifted from orange to a sickly purple, then to a disturbing hue of green. "The enchantment." 3 weeks, give or take, Bink replied, moving to the next one. "Plenty of time for our needs. I'm using a modified version of Continual Flame, tied to a color shift charm. Rather proud of this, actually. Might write a paper on it for the Arcane Quarterly." While Bink works his magical renovations, Jerica began setting her traps. Nicholas looked on with a mixture of admiration and concern as she rigged tripwires across corridors, positioned nets in the ceiling, and created false floor panels that would drop people a few feet onto strategically placed cushions. "You're sure these won't actually hurt anyone?" Nicholas asked for the 3rd time. "Come on, Nicholas." Jerica sighed, securing a rope to an iron ring embedded in the wall. "I've been avoiding traps since I was 7 years old. I know exactly how much is fun scary versus drag through the town square to the hanging post scary. Trust me." "It's the trust me part that worries me." She threw a piece of rope at his head in response. Nicholas found his own role expanding as they worked. He discovered that his holy magic could indeed create glowing sigils on the walls, symbols of the light that he inverted and corrupted slightly to look more ominous than protective. The effect was quite unsettling, almost as if a necromancer had perverted the healing wards of a place. He wanted to give off the effect of this being a forbidden temple. He also began arranging props. The suits of armor the goblins had collected, pieces looted from their various victims over the months, were too damaged to be useful as actual armor, but they were perfect for display. Nicholas positioned them in alcoves and at corridor intersections, sometimes propping them up with sticks and rope to make them look like they were standing guard. "They look a bit too stationary," Bink observed, tapping his chin as he studied Nicholas's handiwork. "Hold on." The gnome muttered another spell that took up a considerable amount of mana. His hands glowed blue and purple, with arcane energy as he touched each suit of armor in turn. When he finished, the armor began to move, just slightly. A helmet would turn as if tracking movement. A gauntlet would flex its fingers. The breastplate would rise and fall as though breathing. "That's horrifying," Nicholas said with genuine appreciation. "Well done." "Thank you. I've been practicing animation charms. Though I should warn you, they're not truly animate, just responding to proximity. Anyone who gets close will trigger the movement. The exact distance at which they sense a presence is variable. Odor might even play a part in it." "Spare me the details, please, Bink," Nicholas said, flicking the suit of armor's helmet away from staring at him. Next, Bink moved to the collection of goblin weapons they'd gathered into a pile. Crude swords, notched axes, bent spears. All of it rusted and stained and thoroughly unpleasant to look at. A couple of magic spells later, and the weapons began to float in midair, rotating slowly and occasionally rattling against each other with a rasping metallic clang. "You're having far too much fun with this," Jerica observed, returning from deeper in the dungeon with an armful of old rope. "I'm a wizard," Bink replied, making a particularly nasty-looking key of a spin in a tight circle. "If I'm not having fun with magic, I'm doing it wrong." As the afternoon wore on, the dungeon transformed before their eyes. What had been a grim but mundane series of caves became something out of a nightmare. The green and purple torches threw writhing shadows on the walls, which made the floating weapons look much more menacing as they rounded a corner. Glowing sigils pulsed with ominous light. Suits of armor stood silent vigil in alcoves, creaking as they turned their helmets to and fro at the slightest nearby movement. Tripwires waited to send the unwary stumbling. Jerica had marked out hiding spots for herself throughout the dungeon, with small chalk X's that only she would notice. These were corners where she could leap out at passing visitors from the shadows. There were ledges where she could drop down from above. Even a few curtain-draped alcoves where she could stand perfectly still until someone walked past, then whisper something unsettling in their ear. "What are you going to say?" Nicholas asked, watching her test one of her hiding spots, a narrow crevice behind a false wall. "Haven't decided yet," she replied, dropping her voice an octave lower in a way that made the hair on the back of Nicholas's neck stand up. "Maybe something like, 'You shouldn't have come here,' or 'They're still watching,' or just breathe heavily right behind them. People hate that." Bink also created illusions that would trigger as people passed certain points. A spectral woman in tattered robes who would appear at the end of one corridor, scream silently, and then vanish. That one was actually something they'd experienced on one of their quests a few months back, when they delved into the catacombs of the Silent Wardens to lay the undead to rest. It had been so traumatizing that Bink still woke up in a cold sweat some nights, with a fireball already conjured in his palm, which wasn't great because he'd almost set fire to their tent a few times doing this. He also rigged up a particularly clever bit of magic in what had been the goblin's throne room, the chamber where they'd kept old Mossback's pumpkin. The altar was still there, and Bink had conjured a permanent illusion of a massive glowing eye that would open slowly above it, scan the room, and then close again with a sound like grinding stone. "That's the centerpiece," Bink said proudly, standing back to admire his work. "Our grand finale before they exit." Nicholas had claimed the corridor leading to that final chamber as his own domain. He donned his full ceremonial armor. It was polished plate mail that he saved for formal occasions, complete with a great helm that completely obscured his face and made him look more like a metal statue than a person. He held his warhammer upright before him like a staff. "How do I look?" he asked, his voice muffled by the helm. Jerica circled him with her head tilted. "Creepy. Very creepy. The height helps. You really do look like a statue, and the shock of a 7-foot-tall armored figure suddenly coming to life should do the trick." They worked through the day and late into the evening, only stopping when the sun had fully set and they could no longer see well enough to work safely, even with the enchanted torches. By then, Nicholas's arms ached from hauling armor, and his legs ached from climbing up and down to place rope and netting, but he felt more satisfied than he had in months. The three of them stood at the dungeon entrance, looking back at their creation. The green torchlight flickered invitingly, or maybe uninvitingly, from within. "We're going to need a few more touches," Bink said, consulting his notes. "Sound effects in the walls, groaning, scratching, maybe some chains rattling. I can enchant stones to produce the sounds when people pass. And I want to set up a fog effect near the entrance. something to disorient people right from the start. I need to finish the false floor in the second chamber, Jerica added, and I want to rig up a few more surprises in the shrine room. Maybe have some of those goblin totems fall over at random. I'll work on my timing for the statue reveal, Nicholas said. I don't want to move too soon and ruin the effect, but don't want to wait so long that people just walk past me. Over the next week, they refined and adjusted. Word of their haunted house had spread through Millhaven and beyond, generating a buzz of excitement that Gerta reported with barely concealed glee when they stopped by the flagon each evening. Folks are excited, she told them, slamming mugs of ale down on their usual table. Nervous, too. Half of them don't believe you can really make it that scary. The other half are already having second thoughts about going. Wonderful tidings, Bink said, taking a sip of his ale and leaving a foam mustache on his upper lip. Anticipation is half the battle. 2 days before All Hallows' Eve, they focused on costumes and final touches. Nicholas had added lengths of vines and roots to the ceremonial armor and splattered the head of the warhammer with red paint to look like blood. He'd even found an old red cloak in a chest at the guild hall, something left behind by a previous tenant, and added it for dramatic effect. When he stood in his alcove now, he looked less like a paladin and more like some ancient cursed knight, forever bound to guard the dungeon's depths. Jerica had outdone herself with her own costume. She'd cobbled together pieces of dark leather armor, added tattered strips of black cloth that would flutter when she moved, and painted her face with white and black face paint that made her already striking features look positively ghoulish. Her horns, usually filed down to be less conspicuous, she'd left at their full length and painted with silver gilt. In the torchlight, she looked like some sort of demon risen from the depths. "You look like you're going to steal souls," Nicholas told her when she revealed the final result. She bared her teeth in a wicked grin that showed off her fangs. Bink had taken a different approach. He'd woven enchantments into his robes so that they would ripple and flow even when he stood still, as though moved by an unseen wind. He'd charmed his staff to emit small sparks and crackles of energy, and he'd practiced a few new illusions specifically for the event, including one that would make his eyes glow bright white when he wanted to unnerve someone. "I'll pose as a mad cultist or something, mutter Romanet's predictions, maybe cackle a bit." "The cackling is important," Jerica agreed solemnly. Bink had also finally created a fog machine. It was actually a large pot of water with a continuous heating spell underneath, positioned near the entrance so that mist would roll out all night. As the sun set on the day before All Hallows' Eve, the three of them stood at the entrance to their creation one final time, going over their plan. "I'll manage the entrance," Bink said,
consulting a list he'd written on a scroll. "Welcome people, take their gold, explain the basic rules, stay together, follow the path, don't touch the exhibits, then send them in. I'll rotate through my hiding spots," Jerica said. "Keep things unpredictable. Hit different groups in different places. And I'll hold my position until people reach my corridor," Nicholas finished.
"Then give them the scare of their lives before they reach the final chamber." "I think we're ready," Bink said with satisfaction. All Hallows' Eve arrived with a dramatic flourish of autumn weather. A cold wind sent leaves skittering across the ground, and dark clouds promised rain later in the evening. There was a chill in the air that made people pull their cloaks tighter and huddle closer to their lanterns. Perfect, in other words. By the time dusk settled over the woods of Arakai, a line of villagers had already formed at the dungeon entrance. From his position, deeper inside, Nicholas listened to the murmur